German exports to countries bordering Russia continue to rise, reinforcing concerns that Moscow is receiving goods it would otherwise have been denied because of European sanctions. The example of Kyrgyzstan is especially dramatic, with the latest data showing exports of German cars and automobile parts have skyrocketed since the invasion of Ukraine, albeit from a low enough base. But the trend can be seen in several other countries neighbouring Russia too. To talk more about this, I'm joined by Robin Brooks. He's the former chief economist at the Institute of International Finance. He's been having a close look at Germany's most recent trade data. Hi, Robin. Good to have you with us. Can you help me understand the significance of this? You're very welcome. What exports are we talking about specifically? And is Russia using these goods to run its war in Ukraine?
So exports to Central Asia are up across the board, not just from Germany, not just car parts and cars, not just to Kyrgyzstan, all of Central Asia, all of the Caucasus, Belarus is also involved. So overall, the numbers are actually pretty significant. When you have sanctions like the West has imposed, there's always going to be a little bit of leakage. So the question is, are these trade diversion exports significant? And I think the answer to that is clearly yes. What does it mean for Russia and for Putin's war in Ukraine? Russia is reorienting its economy to war production. That means all kinds of civilian production is having to be sidelined and shut down and repurposed for military purposes. And so these imports of, for example, cars from Germany are filling a very important need for the Russian economy. And so, yes, they enable the war in Ukraine.
What evidence do you have that these goods are, in fact, being re-exported to Russia? What data are you looking at?
So I track data in aggregate that go from Germany and other countries to Central Asian countries. Now, the growth rates in these export data are so insane. So you mentioned the number of 5,000, which is the growth rate of car and car part exports from Germany to Kyrgyzstan compared to 2019, so before COVID. The growth rates in these exports are so crazy, you cannot possibly justify it with domestic demand in Kyrgyzstan. So there's no way that people in Bishkek are driving around with a lot more Mercedes to this extent than before the invasion. And so there is only one reasonable explanation, which is this stuff is going to Russia. But I do not have data that tracks the individual automobile going from Germany to Kyrgyzstan, Kyrgyzstan to Russia. There is one other wrinkle, which is that Kyrgyzstan stands out. It is probably the most egregious country in the region, stands out as having a lot of exports that in Germany are invoiced as going to Kyrgyzstan, but that never actually in Kyrgyz data show up as arriving in Kyrgyzstan. So a lot of what's going on is you just have invoicing, you have people writing on the invoice, this is going to Bishkek, when in fact it's probably just going to Russia.
And this is all very complicated. We should say the EU has been trying to clamp down on the practice of countries re-exporting sanctioned goods to Russia. In December of last year, new rules went into effect, and they banned companies from re-exporting certain goods that could be used in military systems, in weapons, or in aviation. And crucially, this includes dual-use goods, so items that can be used for civil as well as military purposes. Robin, dual use is kind of a murky term, isn't it? Do these new rules actually apply to the kinds of goods that Germany is exporting to Russia's neighbours?
So let me give you a narrow answer and a broad answer. So the narrow answer is the EU is certainly incrementally making progress on clamping down on this kind of sanctions evasion. But as you said, it is a super gray area because cars, refrigerators, you name it, they all contain microchips that in principle you can repurpose for all kinds of stuff. So that is the narrow answer. I think there's incremental progress. Do I expect these crazy export numbers to come down dramatically because of the latest sanctions package? No. The broader answer is that the EU has kind of, frankly, a mixed track record on sanctions implementation. The exports here that we're talking about is one example. But the G7 oil price cap, what's been going on there is another example. And what's going on there is honestly pretty depressing. You have EU ship owners, most of whom are based in Greece, but also Cyprus and Malta, who at every turn have undercut the G7 oil price cap by selling oil tankers to shadowy interests. So that's basically selling ships to Putin. And the EU has done nothing. So the EU, on a number of fronts, is sending very half-hearted messages on implementation of economic countermeasures against Russia. And so honestly, I think a lot more work needs to be done to enforce much more properly.
But if we look at this particular case, whose job fundamentally is it to make sure that German car parts in Kyrgyzstan don't end up in Russian military equipment?
So I think you can look at this in two ways. There is no way that exports to Kyrgyzstan should increase by 5,000%. There's just no justification for that based on economic rationale. So this stuff is obviously circumventing the direct export to Russia, and it is ending up in Russia. So someone in the German customs agency needs to say, okay, you know, maybe at an individual level, all these transactions are legit, but in aggregate, they are not. And so when I have looked at these data in conjunction with people in official capacities, I think that's the perspective that's missing. It's this top-down look that says, there's just no way that this is legit. Question is what to do. And again, I don't think that this comes down entirely to Germany, because Poland, the Baltics, Czech Republic, everybody in Europe, in the EU is in on this trade. So what is needed is a concerted G7 EU action. And frankly, Kyrgyzstan is a tiny country. It's got almost no systemic importance. You can sanction this one country, and it would have huge repercussions for this trade diversion across the region. Currently, these trade diversion exports are basically seen as risk-free. And if you associate risk with them, I'm pretty sure that these export diversions would collapse across the region.
I think this story just really reinforces how complicated it is to ensure that sanctions on Russia are actually meaningful. What would you suggest is the best policy to make these sanctions effective?
So let me push back on that a little bit. I know that there's a narrative out there that sanctions are complicated, that maybe they never work in the first place. Honestly, I don't think that's right at all. What is true is that we have economic interests in the West that obviously depend on trade with Russia to make money. The Greek shipping magnates that I mentioned are a great example. German and Eastern European exporters are another example. All of these economic interests fundamentally oppose a hard implementation of sanctions. And I think ultimately what is needed is a political message to say, hey, we are going to really enforce this stuff. There are going to be no more exceptions, and the penalties to circumventing our measures are going to be real. And I think you don't have to enforce across the board. You don't have to look at any at each and every individual transaction, but you do have to make an example of one or two people or one or two countries, and I think that'll be enough.
So in this case, your advice would be to impose sanctions on Kyrgyzstan?
Yeah, I think it's overdue. Kyrgyzstan is the most egregious example in the entire Central Asia region and the Caucasus, and it is not at all systemic. And would have huge deterrent effects on all the other trade that's going to the rest of the region. If that is not possible, there is a lot that the EU can do in terms of hardening the implementation of sanctions. As I said, the sale of Greek, Cypriot, Maltese-owned oil tankers to shadowy interests, to undisclosed beneficiaries, that needs to stop immediately. The EU should have banned that a long time ago. The fact that it hasn't, frankly, is a bit of a scandal. Same with exports. You can make an example, the German authorities can make an example of people who are exporting used cars to Central Asia. And again, you don't have to do it across the board. You just have to do it in 1 or 2 cases, and the deterrent effect will be huge.
Robin, finally, we know it's difficult to rely on Russia's official economic data, but if you do believe Putin, the war is providing a boost to his economy at a time when Germany's economy is languishing, to what extent is the continued war in Ukraine putting the brakes on growth in Europe? And on the other side, how long can Russia's war economy last?
So I know there's a big narrative that Germany's the sick man of Europe. European data across the board are pretty weak. It's not just Germany. In fact, on many metrics, French data are worse than German data. This is a big challenge for Europe. There's no denying it. I think the question for European policymakers is, do you want to take concerted action now, with the hope of ending the conflict in Ukraine sooner rather than later? Or do you want to take kind of a drip-drab approach with the risk that we have kind of a forever war in Ukraine? And that would really hurt Europe's economy. So I think European policymakers have done kind of the latter. And I think they need to shift to much more concerted action, much stronger sanctions enforcement, stop Russia from benefiting from high oil prices as it has. And I think that'll do a lot to hurt Russia's economy. In terms of the strength of Russia's economy, I think it's mostly illusory. Obviously, industrial production is ramping up because of weapons production. But what we don't see in those data is increasing deprivation for the civilian population. Obviously, as I said, when you reorient the economy to war production, that means all kinds of civilian uses are being discontinued. So that's bad. So that gets lost in this official commentary that Russia is doing great.
All right. Robin Brooks, former chief economist at the Institute of International Finance. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.